Hi there! Today I'm back with an episode full of fantasy and sci-fi books and worlds which somehow surprised me. They gave me something I hadn't read before, or they gave me an ending where I was like, wait, what? Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host Jules, and I am a very avid fantasy and sci-fi reader. I think I have been since I was a child. There's just something about those different worlds that I could escape to, and yet while escaping I could figure something out about the world that we are actually living in. I think it was Ursula K. Le Guin who said that escapist fantasy is not about escaping from something, but about escaping towards something, right? Because sometimes when you hear, ooh, they're escaping into books, it kind of sounds like you're trying to get away from the real world and not pay attention to things. But no, actually, good fantasy and good sci-fi teaches you something about the world you live in. It makes you a bit more open to maybe other possibilities or solutions you might otherwise not have seen. Hopefully they present a world in which you can figure out how you want to move forward in the actual world that we're living in. So I've selected a couple of books, quite a few, but I'm going to try and keep the playtime to a reasonable time. And I'll introduce them to you, and I'll tell you very briefly, without spoilers, why they surprised me or why they showed me something new or different. So let's get started. Another note, actually, before I get started, is that these are all books that I've read this year. So they are quite recent in that sense, but some of them are also books that have been around for ages. So they're not necessarily current, but they are current in my mind. Okay, the first book is actually a trilogy, and it's The Queen of the Tearling trilogy by Erika Johansen. The first book is called The Queen of the Tearling, the second is The Invasion of the Tearling, and the final third one is The Fate of the Tearling. So I'm going to read you the Goodreads summary of the first book. On her 19th birthday, Princess Kelsey Raleigh Glynn, raised in exile, sets out on a perilous journey back to the castle of her birth to ascend her rightful throne. Plain and serious, a girl who loves books and learning, Kelsey bears little resemblance to her mother, the vain and frivolous Queen Alyssa. But though she may be inexperienced and sheltered, Kelsey is not defenseless. Around her neck hangs the Tearling sapphire, a jewel of immense magical power, and accompanying her is the Queen's Guard, a cadre of brave knights led by the enigmatic and dedicated Lazarus. Kelsey will need them all to survive a cabal of enemies who will use every weapon, from crimson-caped assassins to the darkest blood magic, to prevent her from wearing the crown. But the quest to save her kingdom and meet her destiny has only just begun, a wondrous journey of self-discovery and a trial by fire that will make her a legend, if she can survive. So this is a book I think I first read in 2015, 2016, when I was still in my coming out of my teen years, which means I was still a little bit more on the level of, okay, a 19-year-old protagonist who has the entire world on her shoulders. But what I loved about this first book is that it's full-blown fantasy in the sense of you have this kingdom and there is queens and kings and a queen's guard and there's magic, there is some weird religious institution, etc. And I thought it was excellently crafted. Then I read the second one, The Invasion of the Tearling. And if you were expecting this trilogy to just be full-blown fantasy, Invasion of the Tearling will surprise you, because that's where suddenly a certain sense of dystopia comes in, and you realize that this kingdom of the Tearling, this kind of continent where they live, you're like, where actually is that? Why do they know about things like antibiotics or morphine? Like, why are these words that they have? And you realize, well, maybe actually there is a connection to our own world. How fascinating. And then the third one comes up, and The Fate of the Tearling threw me for an absolute loop because Erika Johansen continues to kind of play with different timelines, with our expectations of where a fantasy story might go. And it has everything, right? It continues to have blood magic and weird kind of maybe paranormal creatures and fate and destiny and magic objects. And yet it is also all about like, how did we get here? Where does this realm come from? And The Fate of the Tearling, so the last book of this trilogy, has an ending. When I reread it again last month, I was like, hold up. Like, I knew this ending was coming, and still it just sits in your stomach. And I'm not saying it's bad. I think it's a very brave ending, especially to a debut trilogy. But it leaves you a little bit like, oh no. So for that, in and of itself, I would recommend it. The Queen of the Tearling trilogy by Erika Johansen plays with the fantasy genre. It plays with bringing in different kinds of genres. It will work against your expectations, but also with them. And it will definitely enrich your reading kind of experience and your reading palette, so to say. I would say that this trilogy also deals with a lot of difficult topics. I would say the romance is relatively muted in it, although it technically is in there. But it deals with a lot of very aggressive themes when it comes to things like self-harm, death, kind of all the worst things you can imagine in this world. They exist in Kelsey's world as well. And Erika Johansen doesn't shy away from describing that, because the trilogy is also something of a critique of government and society, right? But I can wholeheartedly recommend The Queen of the Tearling trilogy by Erika Johansen. My next recommendation for fantasy books, as we're still in that category, that surprised me is City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is part of his The Tyrant Philosopher series. It's the first book in that. But I don't think, kind of looking at the summaries on Storygraph or Goodreads, that they're kind of like directly linked. Like, I think each book features maybe some of the same characters, but they're not like a cohesive trilogy, for example. Anyway, City of Last Chances. I listened to this as an audiobook and I struggled initially. But before we get into my struggles, let's read the summary. There has always been a darkness to Ilmar, but never more so than now. The city chafes under the heavy hand of the Palestine occupation, the chokehold of its criminal underworld, the boot of its factory owners, the weight of its wretched poor, and the burden of its ancient curse. What will be the spark that lights the conflagration? Despite the city's refugees, wanderers, murderers, madmen, fanatics, and thieves, the catalyst, as always, will be the anchorwood, that dark grove of trees, that primeval remnant, that portal when the moon is full to strange and distant shores. Ilmar, some say, is the worst place in the world, and the gateway to 1,000 worse places. Ilmar, city of long shadows, city of bad decisions, city of last chances. So this book came out about 2 years ago, and I started listening to the audiobook, I think, in February of this year. And it took me until about 2-3 weeks ago to actually finish it. And that is because of this fascinating structure that the book has. So usually when I read fantasy literature, it's set kind of like The Queen of the Tearling in an entire continent or an entire country. And you kind of have your main set of characters, but they have a kind of joint storyline, I guess. That is also technically true for City of Last Chances, but the way that it is structured is very different. So it's almost like the city itself is your main character. And as Tchaikovsky kind of hops between the different narratives, or the different, rather, narrators or points of view, you get to know this city better. And Ilmar is an absolute mess. It is a city which is currently under occupation by the Palestine, and they have, for example, the Bureau of Correct Thought, right? So they're overtaken by this empire, land, nation that wants correct expression, correct speech, correct behavior, and it kind of suppresses the chaotic nature of Ilmar itself. And we have a couple of characters that we follow. There is a priest who is the last remaining priest of his god, and his god actually kind of like follows him around. So that's a very fun dynamic. There is a criminal who lives in this criminal underworld, and he's a bit of a braggart, but he goes through a very interesting journey. We have two students who are at the Ilmar kind of university, and they want their country back. They want to preserve their own culture. But we also see the factory owners and the kind of struggles that they're going through. And there is someone from a refugee kind of nation who have created their own little enclave almost within Ilmar. And they are valued very much for the things that they bring, but they're also looked at as foreigners and strangers, which then clashes very interestingly with this extra layer of occupation on top of it. So City of Last Chances, as a book, it is about things like, well, what is the character of a nation, of a city? How do people stand in relation to one another? What are the different layers of a population? Like, how do they interact? And what kind of suspicions do they have against each other? But can they come together to throw off an occupation? But then we also do get insight into the minds of some of the occupiers, right? And on top of all of that, so even though it feels like a book that is very much a social critique, it is full of fantasy aspects. I mean, there's gods walking around. There are enchantments and demons. There is the Anchor Wood, which is this weird portal to somewhere. And then also part of the city is under an extra curse. And all of that comes together to create this incredibly rich tapestry. Or actually, mosaic is the better word, because what Tchaikovsky does, and which is why I initially struggled getting into the book, is that you get the perspective of the fairy as main characters, or you get kind of a glance into their mind's eye, and then every few chapters there will be a chapter called Mosaic, where the narrator is literally sometimes like, okay, let's draw back. Let's have a look at how all these little stones fit together. Like, what are we building here, right? And that was such an interesting approach, I think, to storytelling. I really had to get used to it, but I really enjoyed it. So I can absolutely recommend City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky. It might just need a little bit of time for you to get into it and to fully connect to the characters. But once you do, you're there. My next recommendation is Deathless by Catherynne and Valente. So this one kind of straddles the border between fantasy and folktale. But here is the summary. Koshchei the Deathless is to Russian folklore what devils or wicked witches are to European culture. A menacing, evil figure, the villain of countless stories which have been passed on through story and text for generations. But Koshchei has never before been seen through the eyes of Catherynne Valente, whose modernized and transformed take on the legend brings the action to modern times, spanning many of the great developments of Russian history in the 20th century. Deathless, however, is no dry historical tome. It lights up like fire as the young Maria Morevna transforms from a clever child of the revolution to Koshchei's beautiful bride, to his eventual undoing. Along the way, there are Stalinist house elves, magical quests, secrecy and bureaucracy, and games of lust and power. All told, Deathless is a collision of magical history and actual history, of revolution and mythology, of love and death, which will bring Russian myth back to life in a stunning new incarnation. So this book is from 2011, and I think I read it about 8 years back for the first time, and I kind of raced through it. And then last month I was like, I want to go through this again, but take my time with it and really revel in all of it. And the summary that I just read, it really does sum up why this is such a surprising and innovative fantasy book for me. So it's also more like magical realism, but hey. Because we get these folklore kind of figures and these myths and legends, and they pop up in communist Russia under the USSR. And the way Catherynne brings all of these together and mixes it, it feels incredibly genuine. But it also teaches you something about that time in Russian history. It teaches you something about the revolution. And on top of that, it is a book that feels incredibly alive in a way I can't quite explain. So that is also the reason why it's on this list, because sometimes fantasy can threaten to be a little not dry, but a little bit. Maybe not if you're reading a lot of romantasy, because that is very passionate and alive, right? But fantasy that is proper capital F fantasy. Sometimes it gets so lost in its own world building details that you kind of have to squeeze it dry to get the life that is behind it, right? And that is not the case with Deathless. It is full of passion and impressions and details, and I absolutely adored it. And the way it also plays with what you expect to happen, what you think the answer might be, is just, it's really well done. And rereading it this year definitely sharpened my reading focus again, if that makes sense. Like, you're reading for the details in order to enjoy them, but also to get a picture of this world. And this book also has an ending that made me go, ooh. So for that as well, I would fully recommend Deathless by Catherynne and Valente. Again, this one also does deal with war times. There are explicit descriptions of both famine, warfare, death, etc. But that is all part of the world that she is presenting to you as well. Now, my next recommendation might feel like cheating, because when I say, ooh, this was a surprising fantasy book, and then I give you a fantasy book that is unfinished, you might be like, well, of course it's surprising because it stops about a third through. Yes, but the third that we do have is absolutely stunning, and that book is Aspects by John M. Ford. Here's the summary. Enter the halls of Parliament with Veric, Corin of the Corvaric coast. Visit Strange House with the Archmage Burge. Explore the mountains of Lady Longlight alongside the Pallian Silver, sorcerer. In the years before his unexpected death, John M. Ford wrote a novel of fantasy and magic unlike any other. Politics and abdicated kings, swords and sorcerers' machine guns, divination and ancient empires. Finally, Aspects is here. John M. Ford has written a whole variety of fantasy books which I intend to read. There's one called, I think, The Dragon Waits or Arises, and I've got that one lined up. But Aspects was the one that first kind of crossed my sight. And it was also a book that, because of the denseness of detail and of the interesting things that John M. Ford was doing, I had to get into it initially, because he'll change the smallest of things. And then suddenly I'm like, oh, wait, that's probably what he means by minutes. But that's interesting how he writes that. And oh, this is a parliament. I roughly know how a parliament functions, but this is slightly different. And oh, there's train lines, but there's also maybe magic. And he brings all of these different influences together. And it's such a confident way of world building. And it's both confident in everything that Ford does, but also confident in the sense that he expects you as the reader to pay attention. This is a book where you don't want to kind of skip over a page or something. You do really want to make sure that you're reading every sentence. And that's not a hardship, because his line-by-line writing is very good. There's a lot of richness to it, which really made me enjoy my reading. And then there's just so much detail coming at you. There's so much history, right? Like, there's one character who comes in from a different kingdom or empire, and their grammar of their own language is different. So although he speaks in the language of the country he's currently in, his grammar is still mixed up, right? And those are kind of those little details. I'm like, yes, perfect. Tell me more. Unfortunately, John M. Ford died before he finished this book, and that is tragic in and of itself. It's always tragic to lose a life, and this might sound weird, but it's extra upsetting because this book is unfinished. I think for that in and of itself, though, it is even a useful reading experience, because it allows your mind to kind of spin in all these different directions. If you're one of those readers who absolutely cannot stand to leave a book unfinished, I understand. In that case, maybe don't pick this one up because it will drive you insane. But if you want to see how you can craft a world, how you can set up a plot with so many details, then this is absolutely the book to go for. I would say, like I said, it finishes about after the first third. So just as it finishes, you kind of feel like, ooh, okay, now we're getting like properly into the plot. Like, I'm fully here for this now. And then it stops, and that is heartbreaking, but it's good. So please do give Aspects by John M. Ford a go. So now we've had 3 fantasy recommendations, or actually 4, and I'm going to move on to 3 more sci-fi recommendations. And the first of those is The Wings Upon Her Back by Samantha Mills. I'm going to abbreviate the summary on Goodreads slightly and just give you some of the most exciting aspects for me. 5 gods lie mysteriously sleeping above the city of Radejda. 5 gods who once bestowed great technologies and wisdom, each inspiring the devotion of their own sect. When the gods turned away from humanity, their followers built towers to the heavens to find out why. But when no answer was given, the collective grief of the sects turned to desperation and eventually to war. Xenia was a teenager when she ran away from home to join the mechanically modified warrior sect. She was determined to earn mechanized wings and protect the people and the city she loved. Under the strict tutelage of a mercurial, charismatic leader, Xenia became winged Semilai. I'm going to leave it there for the summary, mainly because that already encapsulates some of the most interesting aspects, namely this idea of gods lying above a city, right? And the way Samantha Mills manages to combine these fantasy elements of gods and faith, etc., but also these strong sci-fi aspects of mechanized wings and the reality of the gods themselves and what are they. It was just fascinating. On top of that, The Wings Upon Her Back switches back and forth between young Xenia, kind of her teenage perspective, and then 36 years later, winged Semilai, so Xenia as an adult, and her kind of disillusionment. And much like City of Last Chances, but in a more sci-fi way, this is also very much a book that questions, almost literally, of what is this city? What is our society? What are we doing? How did we get here? And that's actually something it also has in common with the Queen of the Tearling. Look at me making connections. Anyway, I loved The Wings Upon Her Back. I thought it was beautifully written. I thought it posed some really interesting questions, both to the genres of fantasy, sci-fi, speculative fiction, but also to the reader themselves. There are a lot of aspects to the book that are recognizable, when it comes to training to join a warrior elite. You find that in a lot of fantasy or sci-fi books. But the way it's done here with that realization of an older perspective and to look back at what was this relationship truly like, it becomes beautifully tragic. And it does also, here's your little content notice, discuss abusive relationships, but also kind of city warfare. So there you go. But The Wings Upon Her Back is an excellent book, and I loved what it did with the fantasy and sci-fi genre. Next, there is Stations of the Tide by Michael Swanwick. And this is actually a book from the early 90s, 1991, and therefore it only has a very brief blurb on Goodreads, namely this. When a strange magician and renegade scientist steals the secrets that could save a distant planet from being annihilated by its own ocean's tides, a man is sent to Miranda to retrieve those secrets before it's too late. That is short, sweet, to the point. It tells you everything you need to know. Strangers of the Tide is a solid sci-fi book, I would say, but it definitely has fantasy elements. Miranda is this planet which has centennial tides when the entire planet will be kind of washed away almost by its own oceans. And these tides are about to occur again. And the interplanetary, intergalactic government is sending our protagonist, who is not named, to Miranda to retrieve information which someone else might have stolen. He is much like Semilai in Wings Upon Her Back. He's hit a point in his career where he's like, what is happening? What am I doing? On whose side am I? And now he arrives from a quite bureaucratic environment onto this planet, Miranda, which is thriving with life, has all this history and legends, and really he's on a mission to hunt someone down. It's almost like a spy novel in that sense. It gives James Bond vibes, but in a full sci-fi fantasy environment, which again, it contains things I'd never read in sci-fi before. Swanwick just had certain ideas and he ran with them. And similarly to John M. Ford in aspects, he expects you as the reader to pay attention. You don't want to miss details, right? Not because every single one in and of itself is absolutely vitally important, but because the thing he's building towards, it requires you to have paid attention, to have picked up nuances. And I love it when an author trusts me to pay attention, but it does mean you have to pay attention. Stations of the Tide is lovely. It is full of magic, death, loss. There are explicit sex scenes, so be aware of that. But above all, it also has an ending that made me go, ooh, I didn't see that coming. And it was a happy I didn't see that coming, because I think the clues had been there, which means this is a book I need to reread soon. Because now that I know where the ending might be going, I can see. I love that feeling. So, Stations of the Tide by Michael Swanwick. If you can find a copy, I can heartily recommend it. It's beautiful, vibrant science fiction with just all kinds of stunning ideas that make me go, ooh, I want to read more about that. And then finally, I want to give a shout out to A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martin. I read this one a while back at the beginning of the year, and it had been on my list for ages. And finally, I managed to get to it. So here is the summary. Ambassador Mahit Smare arrives in the center of the multi-system Tchaikovsky Empire only to discover that her predecessor, the previous ambassador from their small but fiercely independent mining station, has died. But no one will admit that his death wasn't an accident, or that Mahit might be next to die during a time of political instability in the highest echelons of the imperial court. Now Mahit must discover who is behind the murder, rescue herself, and save her station from Tchaikovsky's unceasing expansion, all while navigating an alien culture that is all too seductive, engaging in intrigues of her own and hiding a deadly technological secret, one that might spell the end of her station and her way of life, or rescue it from annihilation. A Memory Called Empire is a stunning science fiction book. It again does things I hadn't read somewhere else. And I know it's easy to say that, but considering how much science fiction I've read or watched, a lot of, those Marvel movies, etc., they also engage with science fiction tropes. But some of these books really do things where you're like, oh, you've taken this to the next step, or you've really thought about the importance of these details. And for example, A Memory Called Empire, similarly to, for example, Aspects by John M. Ford, it also plays with language. And similarly to City of Last Chances, it plays with the idea of what does it mean to a country, to a city, to a people to be occupied. And what does it do with their culture, with their spirits, with how they engage with other people? And I loved how this book played with language and literature, and how culture is one of those things that is under threat in occupation, because they'll try and get rid of your language and your books and your poetry, the way you create art, and thereby incorporate you into a larger empire. That was stunning. On top of that, it does have all kinds of delightful sci-fi technology things that I really enjoyed. And I love political intrigue. I've realized, kind of going through this list, that it pops up in quite a few books. I mean, even Deathless by Catherynne and Valente, that has political intrigue because it's all about the Russian Revolution in parts. If you enjoy politicking, people kind of putting masks on so that no one can read their face while they get super mad about a certain decision that is being taken, then A Memory Called Empire is also for you. And it's not, I would say, the easiest of science fiction books. It's not just that it takes place in space, but it has a lot of, like I said, intrigue and detail to it that you do want to pay attention to, so that you know when perspectives are switching, when big things are happening. It's again a book that really rewards taking your time with it and paying detailed attention to it. On top of that, it's a queer fantasy, so that's also nice. Okay, I think this has been a long enough list. I'm going to try and edit it down to a reasonable time, but these are all fantasy and sci-fi books which somehow added something to my understanding of both of those genres. Either because their endings presented me with questions that I hadn't thought to ask before, because they paid attention to details of the genres which sometimes get overlooked because they were complicated and they made my brain work in new ways. For all of these reasons, these are books I can wholeheartedly recommend. If you have a similar recommendation, do let me know. Or if you read any of these books, do also let me know. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.